The morning Naomi Townsend set two plates on the table, she had not meant to do it at all. Her hands had moved the way hands do when grief has worn grooves so deep into the body that the body forgets the reason it stopped. She had reached into the cabinet above the dry sink, fingers wrapping around the cool edge of the second plate before her mind caught up, and by the time she set it down across from her own, she was already standing still, staring at it, unable to breathe right for a long moment. The plate sat there on the rough pine table, chipped at one edge, painted with a faded blue flower at its center, the same plate Edmund had used every morning of their marriage, and it was the most ordinary and the most devastating thing she had ever seen. She stood there for what felt like a very long time. Outside, the wind was moving through the tall grass of the Colorado plain like a quiet conversation she was not part of. The year was 1876, the summer dry and already pressing its heat against the walls of the small homestead that sat 7 miles south of the town of Cutter Creek. The sun was barely up, the sky still that bruised shade of pink and violet that preceded the full assault of a July morning, and somewhere behind the barn the rooster had started his noise. Naomi was 31 years old. Edmund had been 34 when the fever took him 8 months ago, in the last cold days of November, and she had buried him herself with the help of their neighbor old Hector Briggs, and the preacher from town who smelled of pipe smoke and spoke in a voice like distant rolling thunder. She had not cried at the grave. She had cried every night for 6 weeks after, alone in the bed that was too wide and too cold, and then one morning she had simply stopped. Not because the grief was gone, because grief, she had learned, was not a fire that burned itself out. It was more like the river. It went underground sometimes and you could forget it was there, and then one day the ground opened up and you were standing in it again. Like now. She pulled the second plate off the table carefully, the way you might lift something fragile, and she set it back in the cabinet and closed the door. Then she sat down at her own place and ate her biscuit alone. The homestead had 60 acres, most of it dry and stubborn, but she had 17 head of cattle and a kitchen garden that she coaxed water into by hand every other morning from the well. Edmund had built the house with his own hands before she arrived as a bride of 19, and she knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft that came in under the south window in winter, every nail head that had worked its way up through the porch boards. She had learned to do the work of 2 people because she had no other choice. She had learned to fix the fence line herself, to doctor a sick calf, to keep the books in the small ledger Edmund had ordered from a mail house in Denver. She had learned all of it without complaint because complaining required an audience, and she did not have one. The morning after the plate incident, which she told nobody about, because there was nobody to tell, she drove the wagon into Cutter Creek for supplies. It was a Tuesday, hot and bright, the main street of the town shimmering faintly with heat already even at 8:30 in the morning. Cutter Creek was not a large town. It had a general store run by a family named Prout, a livery stable, a small bank that had been robbed twice, a saloon that stayed too busy, a barber shop, a doctor's office that doubled as an undertaker's when the occasion required, and a land office that sat at the north end of the street with its curtains always drawn. Naomi tied her horse to the post outside Prout's and went in. The store smelled of sawdust and dried beans and the faint sweetness of tobacco, and Mabel Prout was behind the counter sorting through a crate of goods with the focused expression she always wore, as though sorting goods were a moral responsibility. Naomi. Mabel looked up, and her expression shifted to that particular softness that Naomi had grown to recognize and quietly dread, the softness of a person who is about to be very kind about a tragedy. "You look thin. Are you eating?" "I am eating," Naomi said, setting her list on the counter. "Flour, baking soda, lamp oil, salt, and if you have any sugar left I would like 2 pounds of it." Mabel looked at the list and then looked at Naomi again. "There is a man at the livery you ought to know about," she said, in the tone of someone delivering news they have been waiting to deliver. "Came in yesterday. Amos Sutton. He is looking for work on a ranch and I thought immediately of you. You cannot manage those 60 acres alone much longer, Naomi, and everyone in town knows it. I have been managing them for 8 months, Naomi said. You have been surviving them, Mabel said, with the gentle accuracy of a woman who had known her for years. There is a difference. Naomi did not argue because there was no point in arguing with Mabel Prout, who was usually right and always stubborn. She took her supplies, loaded them into the wagon, and then, because she was practical above all things, and because she was honest enough with herself to know that the fence on the east side needed a second pair of hands she did not have, she walked to the livery. The livery was dim and smelled of horse and old straw, and the oil that Tomas Reyes, the stable man, used on the tack. Tomas was near the back talking to a man who was tending to a dark brown horse, with the careful attention of someone who had owned the animal for a long time. Naomi stopped just inside the entrance. The man was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a plain canvas shirt and dark trousers tucked into boots that had seen considerable distance. He had dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were large and marked with the kind of calluses that come from honest work done over many years. When he turned at the sound of her footstep, his face was open and square-jawed, with eyes that were a particular shade of brown that reminded her, incongruously, of good coffee. He looked to be somewhere around 33 or 34. He was not a pretty man. He was better than pretty. He was solid and real in a way that the world had too few of. Mrs. Townsend, Tomas called out. This here is Amos Sutton. He is the man your neighbor Mrs. Briggs was asking about for you. Hector Briggs is not my neighbor, he is my neighbor's husband, Naomi said automatically, which was not the most gracious opening she had ever made. Amos Sutton turned fully toward her and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was unhurried and genuine. Ma'am, he said. His voice was low and even, a voice that did not seem to raise itself for effect. Naomi Townsend, she said. I have 60 acres south of town. Mrs. Prout at the general store says you are looking for work. That is correct. What kind of work have you done? Cattle work mostly. I worked a ranch in New Mexico for 6 years before I moved north. Before that, Wyoming. I can build fence, I can doctor stock, I can handle a team, and I can fix most things that break on a working farm. Why did you leave New Mexico? He looked at her steadily. The man I worked for sold the ranch to a land company out of Kansas City. The new owners brought their own men. So you are not running from anything? No, ma'am. She studied him for a moment. He did not shift under the scrutiny, which she appreciated. Men who grew uncomfortable when a woman looked at them directly were not men she wanted on her property. The work would be room and board plus wages. I pay fair. The bunkhouse has 1 room and needs a new window, but it is otherwise sound. I have 17 cattle and a kitchen garden and 60 acres of fence line that needs consistent attention. The work is not glamorous. I did not come here looking for glamorous, he said. Good, Naomi said. Can you start Thursday? I can start tomorrow. She considered that. Tomorrow, then. She walked back to her wagon without looking back, and she drove home, and she spent the remainder of the afternoon pretending that the slight quickening in her chest had been the heat and nothing else. Amos Sutton arrived the following morning on his brown horse, with a bedroll and a single saddlebag, and a battered hat that had been shaped by weather into something that was entirely his own. Naomi met him at the gate with a cup of coffee and a list of what needed doing, and he took both without comment, which was exactly the right response. The first week was strictly practical. He rode the fence line and came back with a report of 7 sections that needed repair. He found a calf with a torn ear that had been missed and cleaned the wound carefully. He repaired the hinge on the barn door that had been hanging wrong since spring. Naomi watched him work from the kitchen window sometimes, not because she was watching him particularly, but because she was the kind of woman who monitored her property, and she noticed that he worked without wasted motion, which she respected. He did not speak much at first. At meal times, she had decided from the beginning to feed him, because it was practical. He ate at the kitchen table, and said thank you and answered questions when asked, and did not volunteer observations about her life or her grief or her management of the farm, which were the three topics every other person in Cutter Creek seemed unable to stop himself from addressing. It was the second week when she learned that he had also lost someone. She had come out to the barn in the early evening to check on a heifer that had been off her feed, and Amos was still there, sitting on an overturned bucket in the last of the day's light, working a piece of leather through his hands in the absent-minded way of someone whose hands need occupation while his mind is somewhere else. He heard her and looked up, and there was something in his face in that unguarded moment that she recognized because she had worn it herself, a heaviness that had nothing to do with tiredness. "I am sorry to interrupt," she said. "You are not interrupting anything," he said, and she could tell he meant it because the thing he had been doing was not really anything. She checked the heifer, who was eating now and seemed better, and then she leaned against the stall door and said, "How long have you been on the road?" "About 3 months," he said. "Since the ranch sold," he turned the piece of leather over. "Since before that, the ranch sold in March. I left New Mexico in April. Before that I had a wife." She waited. "She died in January," he said. "Childbirth. The child too." The words were simple and flat in the way that words become when a person has said them a sufficient number of times to sand down the edges. But the flatness was itself a kind of pain, and Naomi understood it perfectly. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it without performance. "Thank you." He looked up at her. "Mrs. Prude in town told me you lost your husband last year." "November," she said. "Fever." He nodded, not the nod of sympathy exactly, but the nod of recognition, two people standing in the same landscape. "It is strange," she said after a moment, "how much of ordinary life becomes unbearable. Not the large things, the small ones, his coffee cup, the way he stacked wood." Amos was quiet for a moment. "For me it was the sound of the door," he said. "She always came in a particular way. She would push the door open and then pause like she was deciding something. I keep hearing it." Naomi did not say anything, because sometimes the right thing was to let a thing be said without adding to it. She walked back to the house as the stars were beginning. She sat on the porch in the dark for a while and thought about the plate she had set down without thinking, and she thought about the door he kept hearing, and she thought about how grief was perhaps the most solitary thing a person carried and also the most universally shared. July deepened into its most brutal weeks. The heat pressed down on the plain like a hand, and the work continued. Naomi noticed that Amos had begun to anticipate things. The morning she went to the well and found it already drawn. The afternoon the kitchen garden fence was mended before she had mentioned it needed to be. He was not trying to impress her. He was simply paying attention. She understood the difference. They fell into a rhythm the way water finds its level gradually, without ceremony. She cooked in the mornings and left food for him when she went out to the garden. He had begun drinking his coffee on the porch before starting work, and some mornings she brought her own cup out, and they sat in the adjacent chairs that Edmund had built from ash wood, and they watched the light come up over the eastern hills without needing to fill it with words. She did not examine these mornings too closely. She simply allowed them. One Saturday in late July, she drove into Cutter Creek, and Mabel Prude looked at her with an expression that was half curiosity and half something more pointed. "People are talking," Mabel said without preamble. "People in this town have always talked," Naomi said. "They say Amos Sutton is living at your place. He is working at my place. He is living in the bunkhouse." "Naomi, you know that is not the point." Naomi set her hands flat on the counter and looked at Mabel with the steady patience of a woman who has had this conversation in various forms with various people for 8 months. "Mabel, I have 60 acres and 17 cattle, and no husband and insufficient savings to hire a full crew. I have one farmhand who does his work honestly and is not inappropriate in any way and is helping me keep this property alive. If the people of Cutter Creek have thoughts about that, they are welcome to come out and mend my fence themselves." Mabel pursed her lips and then smiled despite herself. "You always were direct," she said. "Edmund liked that about me," Naomi said, and was surprised by how easily his name came out without the usual accompanying ache. It was still there, but softer now, like a bruise going yellow at the edges. On the first Sunday in August, Amos asked if she wanted to ride the south pasture fence with him, as there had been a section he was not sure about and wanted a second opinion on the ground. She agreed because it was her land and she always wanted to know the state of it, and they rode out together in the clean morning air. Her on the gray mare Edmund had bought the spring before he died, and Amos on his dark brown horse, whose name, she had learned, was Rita. The fence line ran along a shallow creek bed that was mostly dry in summer, and the cottonwoods along it were turning their leaves in the hot breeze, showing their pale undersides. The section Amos had been uncertain about was a stretch of about 40 feet where the posts had heaved up in the spring thaw and the wire had gone slack. "This needs replacing," she agreed. "New posts. I figured. I can start Monday." They sat on their horses in the shade of the cottonwoods for a moment, and the silence was the comfortable kind. Then Amos said, out of nowhere that she could identify, "Do you think you will stay on the property?" She looked at him. "Where else would I go? Some widow's cell. Move to town or back to family?" "My family is in Ohio. I have not been back in 12 years. She looked out at her land, the dry pale grass, the distant line of hills, the big sky above it that was everywhere out here inescapable and immense. "Edmund built this place from nothing. He broke this ground. I helped him do it." She paused. "And I love it. I love this land even when it is difficult. Maybe especially when it is difficult." Amos did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That is a rare thing, to love something you have worked hard for. Don't you have a place you feel that about?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I did," he said finally. "The ranch in New Mexico. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains were there in the east, and every morning they would go red in the sunrise. I thought I would die there." He paused. "Then everything changed at once and I came away. I have not found the next place yet." She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and there was something in the directness of it that made her look away first, not out of embarrassment exactly, but out of a kind of caution that was also a kind of awareness. They rode back in easy silence, and she thought about what he had said the next place. And she thought about her land and her house, and the 2 chairs on the porch, and the plate she had put back in the cabinet. And she did not follow the thought to its conclusion, because it was too early for conclusions. The first week of August brought a problem. A man named Dalton Hare, who ran a cattle operation 12 miles north of Cutter Creek, sent one of his hired men to her gate with a written offer to buy her 60 acres. The price was reasonable but not fair. It was the kind of price offered to a person believed to be desperate, a margin below what the land was worth calculated to sound generous to someone not paying attention. Naomi read the letter twice and then set it on the table where she could see it while she thought. Amos saw it at dinner that evening. He did not ask, but she told him, because he was her employee, and it affected his work situation, and she was honest by nature. "Dalton Hare has been buying up everything on this side of the creek for 2 years, he said. "I heard about him in town. He is not a bad man, but he is an ambitious one, and he has money behind him from somewhere that nobody seems to know about. He is offering below market," Naomi said. "Then do not sell." "I do not intend to," she said, "but I wanted to know if you had heard anything." She looked at him across the table. "Do you think he will push harder if I refuse?" Amos considered. "Probably. Men like that usually do. But you have legal title, the land office has your deed, and as long as your cattle are not disappearing and your fence is not being cut, you have nothing that rises to legal trouble. And if the cattle start disappearing, then I will sleep in the barn," he said simply. She looked at him and he looked back, and the matter was settled without further discussion. She wrote back to Dalton Hare declining his offer, politely, but with the firmness of a woman who does not expect to write a second letter on the subject. Hare came himself 2 weeks later. He rode up on a good horse with 2 of his men hanging back at the gate, and he was a stocky, florid-faced man of about 50 who had the manner of someone accustomed to being the most important person in a room. He tipped his hat to Naomi on the porch and said her name with a deliberate courtesy that she recognized as a tool. "Mrs. Townsend, I hope we could talk like reasonable people about the matter of your property." "We can," she said, "as long as talking about it does not mean I am expected to change my answer because I have already given it." He smiled in the way of a man who is used to patience as a strategy. "The offer stands, and I would go higher. The truth is, a woman alone on 60 dry acres is a harder life than you deserve." Amos had come around from the side of the barn at the sound of the horse, as was his habit with visitors he did not know. He stood near the corner of the house now, not threateningly but not invisibly either, and Hare glanced at him and then back at Naomi. "I am not alone," Naomi said, "and with respect, Mr. Hare, the difficulty or ease of my life is not your concern. I am not selling. Good afternoon." Hare looked at Amos again for a long moment, then looked back at her. Something shifted in his expression, a reassessment. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Townsend," he said, and rode away with his men. When his dust was gone, Naomi let out a slow breath. Amos walked to the porch and leaned on the post and said, "You did that well." "I have been managing difficult men my whole adult life," she said. "I believe it," he said, and there was something in his tone that was warmth without agenda, simple and true, and she felt it the way you feel sun on your face after a cold room. That night she sat at the table after supper, and the kitchen was quiet and the lamp was burning low, and she thought about the morning with the plate again. She thought about how her hands had moved without thinking, setting that second place as though the body still believed in something the mind had accepted it had lost. She thought about sitting across a table from someone again, not because she needed to, not because she was afraid of being alone. She had proven she was not afraid of that, but because there was a difference between being alone and being lonely, and she had been both and they were not the same thing. She did not think about Amos Sutton specifically. She was careful about that. But she thought about his hands on the fence wire, and his voice saying she did that well, and the way he had looked at the mountains he had left. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. August passed into September, and the heat began to concede in small daily increments, the evenings growing possible again, the mornings holding a hint of the coming cold that reminded her she needed to think about winter provisions and wood. Amos had already begun stacking wood without being asked, the pile behind the house growing taller each week, and she noticed it the same way she noticed everything on her land, with a kind of proprietorial satisfaction that she recognized was not entirely about the wood. One evening near the end of September, she was on the porch with her mending when Amos came and sat in the other chair uninvited, which he had been doing occasionally for some weeks, and they watched the sun go down together with the particular ease of people who have spent enough time in each other's company that silence requires no management. After a while he said, "I wrote to a man I know in Santa Fe about the money behind Dalton Hare." She looked at him. "You did?" "I know it is your business and not mine, but I do not like men who offer below market and come with 2 riders to back them up." He looked at the sunset. My friend wrote back, "The money comes from a railroad land speculation group out of St. Louis. They are buying up corridors along the projected survey lines." Naomi absorbed this. "So if a railroad comes through here, your land would be worth 4 or 5 times what he offered you." She sat with that for a moment. Then he was not offering to be helpful. "No, ma'am. Thank you for looking into it," she said, and she meant it deeply. He turned his head to look at her, and the last light was on his face, and he said, quietly, "I want things to go well for you here." He said it without embellishment, without the particular care of a man trying to say something important. He said it the way you say a true thing. She held his gaze for a moment. "I believe you," she said. They went back to watching the sunset. The first frost came in mid-October. Naomi woke to white on the ground and a sky so clear and cold it hurt to look at, and she built up the fire in the kitchen stove and made breakfast. And when Amos came in for coffee, his cheeks were red from the cold, and she thought without meaning to that he looked better than she had noticed before. Or perhaps she had noticed and was only now permitting herself to acknowledge it. "Frost," he observed, wrapping both hands around the cup. "I saw," she said. "We need to bring in the last of the garden." "I already started." Of course he had. She looked at him over her own cup and said, "You knew this place before you came here, didn't you? This type of place, I mean, a homestead like this." "My parents homesteaded in Kansas," he said. "I grew up doing this kind of work." "And your wife, was she from New Mexico?" Something shifted in his expression, not pain exactly, but the approach of it, the careful navigation around a tender place. "She was from a small town outside of Albuquerque. Her name was Rosa. She was the daughter of a sheep rancher." He paused. "She was very good at making things. She could look at a piece of land and tell you what it wanted to grow." "She sounds wonderful," Naomi said, and she meant it without jealousy because she was old enough to understand that the dead did not compete with the living. "She was," he said. "She was 30 years old." He said it simply, and simply was the only way it could be said. "Edmund was the kind of man who could fix anything," Naomi said after a moment. "Anything mechanical, anything structural. He could look at a broken thing and understand it immediately. I used to call him a translator of broken things." She smiled faintly at the memory. "He could not cook to save his life, but he could fix anything." Amos smiled, a slow, genuine thing that changed his whole face. "A fair division." "We thought so," she said. They were quiet again, but the quality of the quiet had changed. It was warmer now, charged with the particular intimacy of two people who have shared something real and find themselves on the other side of it, closer than before. It was a Saturday in late October when the thing that had been building between them first broke the surface, like water that has been rising behind a dam and finally finds a seam. She had been in the kitchen baking bread. The first time she had made 2 loaves in months rather than 1, and she had not noticed she was doing it until both were in the oven and she was standing there with flour on her hands thinking about the plate again, the same way she had been thinking about it on and off since July, this recurring reminder that her body remembered things before her mind gave permission. She had set 2 plates again at breakfast that morning. This time she had noticed immediately, and she had not removed the second one. Amos had come in, seen the table, and sat down across from her without comment, and she had poured his coffee and set down the plate of biscuits, and they had eaten breakfast the way they had been doing it for 3 months, and he had said thank you when he rose and gone out to the barn. But something about it had settled in the room after he left, a particular stillness. She was still thinking about it when she went to get more flour from the barrel in the corner and found it nearly empty, which meant a trip to Prute's. She took off her apron and got her coat and went out to hitch the wagon, and Amos was there already with the team half hitched because he had seen from the barn that she was going out and had done it without being asked, as he always did now. "I can drive you in," he said. "I know my way to town," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I wanted to go anyway. I need to pick up a new file from the hardware." They drove into Cutter Creek side by side on the wagon seat, and the October air was cold and brilliant, and the hills were going gold and red, and she was aware of his arm beside hers in the narrow seat, and the warmth that came off him, and the way he handled the reins with those big, capable hands. Mabel Pruitt looked at them walking in together with an expression of poorly concealed delight that Naomi pretended not to notice. They accomplished their separate errands and were walking back toward the wagon when they passed the church, and the preacher, Reverend Aldies, was on the steps talking to a man Naomi did not recognize. He saw them and called out, "Mrs. Townsend, Mr. Sutton." "Good afternoon." They stopped. The Reverend came down the steps with the mild enthusiasm he applied to everything. "I have been meaning to ask. The church social is the 2nd Saturday of November. We would love to see you both there." "I will think about it," Naomi said. "Wonderful, wonderful," said Reverend Aldies, in a tone that assumed she had said yes, and went back to his conversation. They walked on, and Amos helped her up into the wagon seat with a hand at her elbow, a gesture she had not needed and that he offered anyway, not as a statement about her capability but as a small, instinctive courtesy, and she felt the warmth of his hand through her coat sleeve even after he had let go. On the drive home she said, "Do you want to go to the church social?" He glanced at her. "Do Do you? I asked you first. He looked back at the road. I will go if you want to go. That is not an answer. He was quiet for a moment, and then, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his words honestly, he said, I would like to take you to the social, Naomi. If you would like to go with me. It was the first time he had used her first name. She looked at the road ahead of them for a long moment, the brown plain stretching away toward home, and she felt the something that had been building all these months shift and settle into a new shape, not the shape of loss, not the hollow plate-shaped space, but something different and frightening, and also, she realized, something she had been quietly hoping for without fully admitting it. I would like that, she said. He nodded once, and did not try to make it more than it was, which was exactly right. November came in cold and honest, the sky going gray early, and the mornings requiring a coat before anything else. The wood pile Amos had built up was already proving its worth, and he had finished the new window in the bunkhouse and put up extra insulation in the barn for the cattle, working through the shortening days with the same unhurried thoroughness she had come to rely on absolutely. They were spending more evenings on the porch, which seemed contrary to the weather, but which neither of them seemed inclined to abandon despite the cold. They brought out blankets now, and sat with their coffee and watched the stars, which were brilliant and icy at this altitude, and they talked more than they had talked in the beginning about the ranch he had worked in New Mexico, about the small town in Ohio where she had grown up, about books they had read, about the people in Cutter Creek and their particular textures. She learned that he had grown up in a house with 4 brothers, and that he had been the middle one, neither the eldest's authority nor the youngest's ease, but something self-created in between. She learned that he had a gift for fixing things mechanical, like Edmund, but that he had also read everything he could get his hands on, that he had carried books in his saddlebag across New Mexico and Wyoming and Colorado, and wore them out, and mailed them back to a library in Albuquerque that did not know they were receiving donations. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that appeared in small, unexpected flashes, as economical as everything else about him. He learned that she could ride better than almost any man in Cutter Creek, and had outrun a thunderstorm on horseback once that would have killed her if she had been a second slower. He learned that she had wanted to be a school teacher before she came west and had never entirely stopped wanting it, that she kept a small shelf of books in the bedroom that she rationed carefully, reading each one twice before moving to the next. He learned that she was fierce and patient in equal measure, and that both qualities came from the same place, a core of honesty about what was and was not possible that she had honed over 12 years on the plain. The church social was on a Saturday, and she wore her dark blue dress, which was her best, and braided her hair up and put on the small silver earrings that had been her mother's. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment and thought about the last time she had dressed for something that was not strictly functional, which had been Edmund's birthday last year, before everything changed. Amos was waiting by the wagon in his good shirt and his hat brushed clean, and when she came out he looked at her in a way that was quiet and completely clear, and she found she did not look away. The social was held in the church hall, which was warm and bright with lanterns, and the town had turned out in force. The Pruitts, the Briggses, the Aldi's family, the hardware man and his wife, the doctor and the schoolmistress and various ranchers and shopkeepers and their families. There was music from a fiddle player named Conway who had 3 fingers on his left hand and still played beautifully, and there was food on long tables and the particular warmth of people gathered together against the approaching winter. Mabel Pruitt came to Naomi the moment they arrived and embraced her with genuine feeling, and then looked from her to Amos and back with an expression of satisfaction she did not trouble to conceal. "You look wonderful," she told Naomi. "Both of you." Naomi introduced Amos to the people he had not yet met, which was most of the town, and she watched him with those people and noticed how he was straightforward and warm and not interested in performing himself, asking questions that were real questions and listening to the answers. Old Hector Briggs, who was a good judge of character in the way of men who have seen much, shook his hand and said, "You are doing good work out at Naomi's place. She needed someone. She needed someone who could handle the fence line," Naomi said immediately, and Hector laughed his big slow laugh. They danced twice. Conway played a waltz in the later part of the evening, and Amos asked her with a gravity that was also slightly uncertain. And she took his hand and they danced in the warm, crowded hall, and she was aware of his hand at her back and the way he moved carefully, as he did everything, with full attention. And she looked up at him once and found him looking at her, and neither of them said anything. They drove home under stars that were diamond cold, and the road was silver with frost, and she was warm from the dancing and the evening. She sat close beside him on the wagon seat, closer than she strictly needed to, and he did not mention it, and neither did she. At the house he helped her down, and they stood for a moment in the cold darkness with the barn behind him and the porch light ahead of her, and the distance between them was very small. "I had a good evening," she said. "So did I," he said, and then quietly, "Naomi," she waited. "I do not want to make anything complicated for you," he said. I know it is not simple. I know what you have been through. I know what I have been through. I am not going to pretend I do not feel something, because I am not a man who is good at pretending. But I want you to know that whatever you need this to be, it can be that." She looked at him in the cold, pale light and felt something move in her chest like a door opening. "And if what I need it to be is something more than what it has been," she said very quietly. He was still for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand carefully, the way you would hold something you were afraid of breaking, and the warmth of it went all the way up her arm. "Then that is what it will be," he said. She stood there in the cold with her hand in his and the stars overhead and the plain stretching away in every direction. And she thought of Edmund, and she let herself think of him fully and with love. And then she thought of this man beside her and felt no disloyalty, only the strange grace of a life that continued. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee." He came inside. They sat at the kitchen table together until well past midnight, drinking coffee and talking. And when he finally went back across the yard to the bunkhouse, he paused at the door and looked back at her on the porch. And there was something in that look, simple and clear and full, that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Winter settled over the plain in December with a serious intent that had nothing playful about it. The snows came and the temperatures dropped, and the world narrowed down to the homestead and its needs and the warmth of the house and the daily rhythms of feeding the stock and keeping the pipes from freezing and managing the stores they had laid in through the fall. They were together more in winter, by necessity and by choice. He ate breakfast and supper at the kitchen table every day now, and it was not a formal arrangement. It had simply evolved, the way things evolve when they are right, without announcement. She cooked and he did the dishes when she was tired, or she did them herself when he was. They read in the evenings, both of them at the table, the lamp between them, the stove ticking with heat, and sometimes one of them would read a passage out loud and the other would respond, and they would talk about it. He kissed her for the first time on Christmas Day. She had made a small Christmas dinner with a chicken from her flock and a dried apple pie, and he had produced, unexpectedly, a small carved wooden figure of a horse that he had made in the bunkhouse, which she understood instantly was not a casual gift but a careful one, made over time with intentionality, and she looked at it in her hands and then looked at him, and her throat closed. "It is beautiful," she managed. He was watching her face with the full attention he gave to things he cared about. "She said yes," he said softly. "What? When I asked Rosa to marry me, she said yes. And then she said, Amos, you love people and things, you ought to know that about yourself. She meant I show it in what I make and what I fix, not in what I say." He paused. "I have been thinking about that lately." Naomi set the horse very carefully on the table. Then she stood up and crossed the short distance between them, and she put her hands on either side of his face, which was warm and real, and she kissed him. And he kissed her back with both hands coming up to her waist, and it was not a desperate or urgent thing, it was full and slow and entirely itself. When she pulled back, she looked at him and his eyes were bright, and she said, She was right about you. She usually was, he said, and there was grief and love in it equally. I know, Naomi said. I know. January was cold and hard, and they weathered it together, which made all the difference. The cattle needed more tending in the deep cold, and twice there were minor crises. A water line froze and burst, and they worked together for 6 hours in the freezing barn to repair it. And one of the older cows developed a respiratory illness that took 2 weeks of careful nursing before she turned the corner. They worked side by side through all of it, efficient and complementary, each knowing by now how the other thought and moved. On a Sunday in mid-January, a rider came from the land office in Cutter Creek, with a letter that was official and formal and very good. The railroad survey had been completed, and the projected line ran through land 12 miles north of hers, which meant that Hare's interest in her property had been based on faulty information from the beginning, or that the survey had changed. Either way, the letter confirmed her title was recorded and clear, and no further land acquisition inquiries had been filed in her name. She sat with the letter for a long time, and then she looked up at Amos, who was reading across the table, and she said, "The railroad is not coming through here." He looked up. "Then Hare will lose interest." "Yes," she paused. "It also means this land is not going to be worth what I once thought. Do you care?" He asked simply. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "Not really. I did not come here to sell it." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "You came here to live on it." "Yes," she said. He went back to his reading and she went back to hers, and the stove ticked warmly between them. February came with a blizzard that pinned them inside for 3 days, and they spent the time productively. She sewed, and he repaired a set of harnesses that had been needing attention since fall, and they talked more in those 3 days than perhaps in any previous period of the same length. He told her about New Mexico in detail, the high desert light, and the way the Spanish and the Anglo and the Mexican and the native populations of that territory lived in sometimes uneasy, sometimes graceful proximity, the injustices that ran like fault lines under the surface of ordinary life. He told her about the Apache territory conflicts that had marked his years there, the things he had seen that he was not proud of having witnessed without being able to change, the complexity of a land that was not simply settled but contested, claimed by multiple peoples with equally fierce attachment. "Were you in any of it?" she asked, meaning the conflicts. "I worked a ranch that employed Mexicans and 2 Navajo men alongside Anglo hands," he said. "The Navajo men were paid less. I knew it was wrong. I did not do enough about it." He said it without excuse. "I left New Mexico with that on my conscience." She appreciated the honesty of it. Edmund felt the same about things he saw in Kansas during the settlement wars, she said. "There are things this country does to people that are not right and that ordinary people do not have the power to fully change, but knowing it and naming it is not nothing." "No," he said. "It is not enough, but it is not nothing." The blizzard broke on the 3rd day, and the world emerged white and blazing, every surface a mirror of the cold sun, and they went out together to check on the cattle, and it was so beautiful in its severity that she stopped and simply stood for a moment and looked at it. He stood beside her. "Still love it," he said. "Especially when it is difficult," she said. He laughed, full and real, and she realized it was the first time she had heard him laugh like that. Not the quiet, private smile he usually allowed himself, but a real laugh, unguarded, and she loved the sound of it. Spring 1877 came gradually and then all at once, the way it does on the plain, one morning turning from gray to every shade of green seemingly between breakfast and supper, the grass coming up and the cattle moving with new energy, and the kitchen garden starting to show its first cautious green lines. Naomi was outside every morning early, on her knees in the dirt, and Amos had already repaired the garden fence completely and added a new section to it to expand the growing area. In March, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen after supper, standing with his coffee cup in his hands the way he had that first week, and she thought fleetingly of the very first morning she had driven to the livery and seen him with his horse and the careful calibrated look of someone not performing anything, and she thought of everything between that morning and this one. "Naomi," he said, "I know what I want and I know what I am. I am not a man with great property or great prospects. I am a man who will work this land with you for the rest of my life if you will have me. I will be faithful and honest, and I will try to be worthy of you." He paused. "You are the most remarkable person I have met in my life. You always were from the first morning. I would be grateful every day if you would marry me." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she set down her own cup and crossed to him and said, "I have been ready to say yes for quite some time, Amos Sutton. I was waiting for you to get around to asking." He laughed again, that full, unguarded laugh, and then he put his arms around her and she rested her face against his chest and felt the solidity of him, the warmth and the realness, and she thought, this is what it is like when the right thing happens at the right time, not without difficulty, not without cost, but right. They were married in May, at the Cutter Creek Church, with Reverend Aldi's officiating and Mabel Prout crying openly in the front pew, and old Hector Briggs beaming like a man who had arranged the whole thing himself, which he had not, though he would tell the story that way for years. Naomi wore the dark blue dress again and carried wild blue columbine from the hillside, and Amos wore his good shirt and a new jacket that Mabel had helped him obtain from the dry goods man, and they stood in the light coming through the church windows and said their promises to each other with the steadiness of people who have already tested what they feel against hard reality and found it solid. After the ceremony there was food and music in the church hall, and Conway played his fiddle and they danced. And this time she did not think about dancing with Edmund because she had already made her peace with that, had said those goodbyes not once but in small increments over the months, and she danced with her husband, her new husband, her chosen husband, and felt entirely present. Dalton Hare, it turned out, had already moved his land acquisition interests north along the real railroad corridor and was no longer a concern. He sent a brief note of congratulation when he heard about the marriage, which was either genuine or strategic, and either way did not require a response beyond a polite acknowledgement. The summer of 1877 was a good one. The cattle were healthy, and the garden was abundant, and Naomi found that having two people to manage 60 acres made those 60 acres feel different, not just practically but in spirit. She had been strong alone. She was something else with a partner. They worked the land together every day, and in the evenings they sat on the porch in the ashwood chairs and watched the light leave the sky and talked or were quiet with equal ease. Sometimes he read aloud to her. Sometimes she did to him. They were two people who liked words and silence in the same proportion. On a warm evening in August she told him she thought she was pregnant. He went very still. She watched him carefully, because she knew what he was carrying, the memory of January in New Mexico and what that word had cost him, and she wanted to be ready to meet whatever came across his face. What came across his face was terror and joy in such close proximity that they could barely be told apart, and then he crossed to her and took both her hands, and she could feel how hard his heart was beating through his grip. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. He held her hands and breathed for a long moment. "I am afraid," he said with complete honesty. "I know," she said. "So am I, but I am also—" She stopped and smiled. "I am also very happy." He lifted her hands and pressed them to his face, and she felt his breath on her knuckles, and she thought of all the things that had to happen to bring two specific broken people to exactly this point, and she felt the weight and the grace of it simultaneously. The pregnancy was careful, and she was healthy, and Amos became a creature of vigilant attention, not suffocating but present, always within a range that was calibrated to her well-being without constraining her independence, which she would not have tolerated and which he understood. He learned everything he could. He drove into Cutter Creek and had a long conversation with Doc Hendricks and came home with specific information, and she did not find this excessive but rather deeply moving. In the cold January of 1878, their son was born. Doc Hendricks attended, and Mabel Prout sat in the kitchen to be useful if needed, and Amos was in the room with Naomi, which was not the usual practice, and which she had required, and Doc Hendricks had agreed to with only minor protest. The birth was hard but not dangerous, and when it was over and the child was placed in Amos's arms, she watched her husband's face and saw something pass over it that was beyond what words could be assigned, the grief of what he had lost, and the grace of what had been given, all at once, like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. He looked at the baby, red and furious and alive, and then at her. "He has your mouth," she said. Amos laughed, and she could hear that he was crying while he laughed, and she reached out and took his free hand and held it. They named the boy Elias Edmund Sutton. Edmund for the man who had built the house and the land and been her first love and her first loss. Elias because Amos had always liked the name, and it suited the child immediately and completely. Mabel Prout came in to see the baby and wept without apology. Old Hector Briggs came the following day and held the child with the careful reverence of a man who loves babies and is afraid of them. Reverend Aldies came and said a prayer that was genuinely beautiful. The winter passed in the particular New World exhaustion and joy of an infant in the house, the sleep coming in broken pieces, the days restructured around the needs of this new small person. Amos got up at night without complaint and walked the baby when he cried, and Naomi nursed, and they traded the hours off in a seamless partnership that had been building in them since that first August, when he came to work her fence. By spring, Elias was sleeping better and smiling, and Amos carried him in the evenings around the property, showing him the cattle and the sky and the garden with the solemnity of a man conducting an introduction of great importance. Naomi watched this from the porch and felt a happiness so complete and ordinary that it almost frightened her. Almost. On a morning in April, Naomi was in the kitchen starting breakfast, and Elias was in his cradle in the corner making the small contented noises he made on mornings when the light was good, and she reached into the cabinet and took down 2 plates without thinking and set them on the table, and then a third for the space where the cradle sat, and then stopped. 3 plates. She stood at the table for a moment, very still, looking at the 3 places she had set 2 adults and a cradle in the corner, and she felt the memory of the first morning, the morning with the single extra plate, the morning she had stood at this table for so long not knowing what her hands had been trying to tell her. She understood it now. Her hands had remembered that morning. They had reached toward the future before her mind had permitted herself to believe in it. They had set a place for something she did not know yet was coming, a life that would be full again, different than before, its own complete and precious thing. She set the coffee pot on the stove and heard the bunkhouse door, no, the back door, because he slept in the house now. Their house, and then Amos came in with cold morning air on him and his hair unsettled from sleep, and he looked at the table, and then at her, and there was something in his expression that said he saw everything she was thinking. He came to her and put his arms around her from behind, and she put her hands over his, and they stood together at the table with the 3 plates and the baby making his morning sounds in the corner and the light coming in through the south window. "Good morning," he said against her hair. "Good morning," she said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Elias made a louder sound that was clearly an opinion about breakfast, and they both laughed, and she turned in his arms and kissed him once and then pulled back to get the eggs. He sat down at the table with the baby against his shoulder, and she cooked, and they talked about the fence section that needed attention on the west side, and the garden she wanted to expand, and whether they had enough feed for the cattle through the next cold spell, and it was ordinary and complete in every possible way. 2 more years brought 2 more changes to the Sutton homestead. In 1879, they added a proper addition to the house, a 2nd bedroom and a larger kitchen, which Amos built himself with help from Hector Briggs and the carpenter from town over the course of a dry August. Naomi stood at the threshold of the new kitchen when it was finished and ran her hand along the new pine wall and felt the continuity of it. Edmund's hands in the original walls, Amos's hands in the new ones, and somewhere in the middle, the unbroken thread of her own presence on this land. In the autumn of 1879, she found out she was pregnant again. This time, while Amos was still careful and still attentive, there was less terror in his face and more of the pure joy that had been waiting to come forward. The second birth was easier, faster, and more straightforward, and this time it was a girl, born in the early morning of March 1880, with the sunrise just beginning outside and the meadowlarks starting their first notes of the season. They named her Clara Rosa. Clara because it was Naomi's grandmother's name, and because the word meant clear and bright and the child was both. Rosa for the woman who had not survived, the woman who had said, Amos, you love people and things, you ought to know that about yourself. It was the right naming, full of love without grief taking the lead. Elias at 2 years old was fascinated by his sister in the single-minded way of toddlers, and had to be kept from pressing his face directly against hers at all times. Amos sat with both children one evening, Elias in his lap and Clara in the crook of his arm, and Naomi watched from across the kitchen and felt such a fierce and quiet gratitude that she had to look away for a moment toward the window. She looked at the table. 4 plates now, though 2 of the children were too small to use the proper ones. Still, she had set 4 places as a habit, the way she had once set one, and it struck her fully and beautifully. A long time ago, it felt like a very long time, she had stood at this table in the early morning light not knowing what her hands meant by their reaching. She knew now. She had always been reaching forward without knowing it, through the grief and the hard work and the careful months, toward this full and ordinary life. She turned back to the room. Elias was pulling on Amos's ear and making a declaration about the cow he had decided was his personal cow. Clara was asleep against Amos's chest. Amos was looking at Naomi with that look she had come to know entirely, the one that was always real, always full, never performed. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking," she said, "that I set 4 plates this morning." He understood immediately. He always understood the plate. "Good," he said very simply. She sat down at the table and he passed Elias to her, and Elias grabbed immediately for her braid, and she laughed and Amos held Clara against his shoulder, and the stove was warm and the evening was coming on gold and slow over the plain. Outside, the prairie stretched away in every direction, vast and beautiful and demanding, and hers theirs. This ground they had chosen to love in spite of its difficulty, maybe because of it, under the enormous western sky that asked no one's permission to be magnificent. Inside, the kitchen held them all, warm and lit and complete. The plates on the table were 4. All of them had someone at them now. The story of the homestead would be told in later years by Elias, who would grow up to be a man very much like his father, steady-handed and honest, with a dry humor that appeared in small, unexpected flashes. He would tell it to his own children, who were born in the 1900s, and who found the Wild West their grandparents had inhabited simultaneously thrilling and unimaginable. He would tell it the way his mother had told it to him, sitting on the porch of the house that Amos had expanded and reinforced and maintained for 30 years, with the ashwood chairs that Amos Townsend had built still on that porch, their wood worn smooth with use and time. The part he told most often was the part about the plate. He had heard his mother tell it many times, how she had stood at the table one morning, 8 months after she buried his father's predecessor and her first husband, and set a second place without thinking, and stood there for a long time not knowing whether she was mourning or remembering or reaching toward something she could not yet name. She always said the same thing at the end of it, that she did not know until much later what the plate had meant, but she trusted her hands because her hands had always known the truth before the rest of her caught up. And Amos, sitting in his ashwood chair with his coffee and the particular patience of a man who has heard the story many times and never found it less worth hearing, would nod at this and say, quietly, "The hands know." He was still working the land at 60, the same unhurried thoroughness, the same capability in the bones of him. Naomi still rose early and cooked in the morning light, and kept the books in the ledger, and knew every creak of every floorboard and every fence post on the 60 acres, and they were still doing it together, side by side, in the house that was theirs made out of the houses of two lives. Clara grew into a formidable young woman with her mother's directness and her father's patience, and she went to school in Cutter Creek, and was going to be a teacher, which had been Naomi's first dream before the West claimed her. Naomi helped her study in the evenings and felt a satisfaction so particular and deep that it had its own flavor, the flavor of a thing coming around. The town of Cutter Creek grew in those years, the railroad bringing people and change as railroads did, and the homesteads around them were bought and sold and changed hands, and the open plain gave way gradually to more fences and more roads, and more of the complicated human business of settlement. Naomi and Amos watched it all from their porch, not without ambivalence. They had both seen enough of land and its taking and its complications to know that beauty and injustice often lived in the same landscape, but with the steadiness of people who had committed to their particular piece of ground and intended to honor it. Some things did not change. The sunrises were still enormous. The winters were still serious. The work was still constant, and the satisfaction of it still real, still the specific deep satisfaction of hands and purpose together, of something grown and tended. And every morning, Naomi Townsend, Naomi Sutton now, though she kept both names in her heart, the two halves of a life that had been broken and remade into something larger rose in the early light, and went to the kitchen and made coffee and started breakfast. And the plates she set on the table were for all of them, the family that had grown out of the wreckage of two lives and a single lost morning at the beginning of it all. When her hands had known what she did not yet know and had reached across the table for the thing that was coming, she never forgot it. She was grateful for it every single morning of her life.